want to thank you for this invitation to discuss our new subcommittee on climate services and the climate mapping for resilience and adaptation, our camera portal. But big thanks to Megan for helping them make these connections. I do want to give a shout out to our NOAA colleagues. This is the work of NOAA, primarily with Esri, so David Herring, Luann Dahlman, Ned Gardner, and Kim Valentine. And I'd also like to thank the entire interagency for helping to stand up the subcommittee on climate services. That is the work of you all. Next slide, please, Megan. So a lot of our work was really catalyzed by Executive Order 14008 on tackling the climate crisis, and it really catalyzed renewed interest in enhancing climate services. So two important reports are on your bottom left. Most important is the one in the middle, a federal framework and action plan for climate services released in March of 2023. And that really helped operationalize the vision shown here, in which every American, every community, and every business has access to usable climate services, really empowering them to prepare, respond, and be resilient to climate change. And then the box on the right shows different aspects of that federal framework and action plan, developing a coherent and durable framework for coordinating federal climate services, i.e. the SCS that we've set up, developing a common understanding of the breadth and depth of climate services across the federal family, but also recommending key actions to advance the federal climate services enterprise. And if you look through that report, we've actually achieved or started many of those recommendations. So pretty impressive to actually take action on a federal report. Next slide, please. The report does a really great job of recognizing both producers and users of climate services. There's a really great table showing climate services across different federal agencies, including Housing and Urban Development, General Services Administration. And I think part of our effort has really been focused on ensuring user-oriented agencies are at the table and hearing their needs and concerns. I really like this figure from the report. It's the climate services knowledge value chain. And I do want to recognize that even though it's linear, there are the feedback loops in the gray showing that users, decision makers, and communities help drive the feedback loops going from generation, development, delivery, and use and evaluation of climate services. Next slide, please. This is just a really wordy slide, but just an overview of the Subcommittee on Climate Services. It was set up under the National Science and Technology Council back in January of this year, so signed by Drs. Rick Finrad, Administrator of NOAA, Dr. Dane Luchenko, the Deputy Director of Climate and Environment at OSTP, and Dr. Chris Frey of EPA ORD. The purpose of the SCS is to coordinate the provision of federal climate services, building a more cohesive and strategic federal climate services enterprise, ultimately to reduce the burden on users to use such data and services. So, our users don't have to go knocking on so many doors, building a no wrong door approach. I list some of the authorities derived for the SCS. No, that's good, Megan. Let's go to the next slide. This just lists some of the value add of the SCS. So the SCS is also a sibling subcommittee to the Subcommittee on Global Change Research, or SGCR, some of you are aware of that. So both SGCR and SCS will have shared responsibilities for the U.S. Global Change Research Program. And many of you are familiar with USGCRP either through the National Climate Assessment or the National Nature Assessment, and now also hosting the IPCC Working Group 3 Technical Support Unit. But really, the synergistic support of SCS is to provide support to the CALE strategic plan for USGCRP, especially around engaging the nation and informing decisions. I'll also add from this slide that we're really shifting from an ad hoc opportunistic approach to climate services to one that's more coordinated and cohesive, again, reflecting both breadth and depth of federal services. Next slide, please. So now I'll shift on to CAMRA. So CAMRA is the Climate Mapping for Resilience and Adaptation portal, or available at resilience.climate.gov. CAMRA is a screening tool to help community leaders, grant officers, and other different types of audiences recognize assets that may be exposed to current or future climate hazards. CAMRA provides county-scale climate projections for the recent past and for 3 periods during this century. Currently, it is for CMIP 5, but it will be updated for CMIP 6. And David here can update you on the technicalities of that. But most importantly, CAMRA connects climate projections data with relevant resilience planning resources. So that's hazards information, federal programs and policies, and funding opportunities across the federal family. Next slide, please. This is a slide just showing how CAMRA was developed. It was initially championed by the Executive Office of the President back in September of 2022, initially to support bipartisan infrastructure law investments and now Inflation Reduction Act investments, but really just providing detailed location-specific data on climate threats, bringing together multiple data sets, but also funding opportunities. And it also supports, as I mentioned, climate resilience programs and investments. We did add this bit on the bottom that CAMRA also advances the administration's priorities on actionable climate science and services, supporting the federal framework and action plan for climate services that I mentioned earlier, but also the National Climate Resilience Framework, which came out back in September of 2023. Next slide, please. So part of CAMRA includes a real-time hazards dashboard, and this is where you can find out where people, property, and infrastructure are currently exposed to 6 common climate-related hazards, and we were really excited to announce extreme cold as the 6th hazards during COP28 in Dubai. So really exciting news. Next slide, please. CAMRA also has information on federal policies on resilience, and the website was recently updated to show how federal agencies are helping people address their climate-related challenges. So you can see information on federal actions and policies on adaptation planning happening led by CEQ, nature-based solutions, sea level rise, information on flood risk management, including the updates to FFRMS and also building codes. Next slide, please. And then this just shows what the page looks like on the federal funding opportunities, which has comprehensive lists of federal funding opportunities related to climate hazards, which are accessible through this navigation bar. So you can search by all hazards or through the different hazards. And from a recent search, you can find information on, HUD, low-income housing type opportunities to Forest Service and urban forestry planning. So really impressive list. Next slide, please. So the assessment tool shows past and projected conditions related to 5 climate hazards. I believe when you click on that link, you can either enter your city or your zip code. It currently uses 2 emission scenarios and 3 timeframes, early, mid, and late century. I list just some of the variables of interest that may be of interest to you, including annual days above a maximum temperature, and you can change that threshold. Also, maximum number of consecutive dry days, and they are organized by 5 climate hazards: extreme heat, drought, wildfire, flooding, and coastal inundation. And they will be updated with CMIP 6, i.e. NCA 5, later this calendar year, I believe. David says yes, so good. Next slide, please. So this is just a picture of what that assessment will look like if I were to put District of Columbia. Again, you can see the 5 climate hazards and the relevant variables associated with that hazard. And you can change the time period, and where Megan is showing her little cursor. And then the really cool graph and also table of information on the far right on the indicator details. I do want to note, this is also linked to the Justice 40 initiative. So it does show the percent of the population in disadvantaged communities. So when you click that, it goes to the CJS tool. And then it also is linked to building codes data from FEMA. So also linked to that as well. And I believe if you were to click on obtaining a report, it also features FEMA's National Risk Index data as well, so linking to that data source as well. Next slide, please. I believe this is my last slide. I do want to note that CAMRA, the atlas for the 5th National Climate Assessment, are part of a larger system or ecosystem of tools. We are building out CRIS, the Climate Resilience Information System, and that will really serve as a foundation of projection data for these various tools. And as it says here, a warehouse of consistent data for designers of climate services. They're really acting as, and then CAMRA, NCA 5 Atlas, different other tools will be kind of storefronts for CRIS essentially. So if you have a mall, you can see CAMRA kind of like Nordstrom. I think NCA 5 could be like JCPenney, maybe a different store, but really obtaining data from the same source. But then you can see how they're all interrelated, but they have their different audiences for their use. And that will also be available this upcoming calendar year, targeting September. So this fiscal year, very exciting. Megan, I think that's my last slide. Yeah. And then David is here next to me. So if there are any quick questions, and Megan, are we still on time?
Yeah, you should be fine, Julian.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, we talked really fast. I wanted to get through all this really important information, but thank you again for the opportunity.
Sure. Hey, David, how are you?
Hold on.
Oh, hi, David. How are you? Still can't hear me?
Can y'all hear me?
Hear us?
Yes.
Turn up the volume.
Yeah, David, I think you're just a little bit further from the mic, but we can hear Julian. And I think David, if you project or yell,
Okay.
and apologies ahead of time for Julian's right ear. So far, no one
Anyway,
has
do
some
we have
hands
any
up.
questions? All right, well, I have a couple. First of all, David, it's good to see you again.
Hi, Dan. As well.
Yeah. I guess the question that I have, and I think, I don't know how much of the earlier conversation you were able to capture, but, you know, as we're going through this process, especially this summer of trying to refine the ASCE requirements or needs for climate information, you know, what we found over the last couple of years is, you know, collecting information to inform decision making, collecting climate information to help communities understand their risk, et cetera. You know, that's a very important component of this, but oftentimes those systems aren't well designed to meet the needs of engineering design. So what my question is how can we leverage CAMRA or how can we plug into the Climate Services Subcommittee to better inform federal agencies about, you know, the difference between understanding vulnerability or risk and then designing a specific solution, an engineered solution to operate under those future conditions? How can we, do you see an opportunity for us to plug in and help inform this discussion?
I think so. As Julian mentioned, you know, we considered CAMRA to be sort of a storefront for consumers, particularly targeting people in, say, municipal government, or people who do asset management of different kinds and planning. Whereas CRIS, the Climate Resilience Information System, is intended to be more of an open and interoperable infrastructure. We like to say being designed for designers. And so it would be interesting to have a conversation where we start to unpack the point you just made, Dan, where if there are particular needs or specific tools or resources built on top of CRIS that would be of service to civil engineers in your community, you know, we'd like to hear that and characterize and understand it. It's designed so it's open and accessible to everyone. Once we stand it up, we're going to have an annual developers forum where we can begin to co-invest, shall we say, in development to be able to build interfaces and tools and utilities so they're seamlessly interoperable within the CRIS system. And so if there are people who are already working on the types of tools that your community needs, we might be able to fund them to adopt and adapt what they're already doing and then build those bridges that you're talking about. But in short, I would welcome an opportunity to have that conversation to really start to unpack how that could be built on top of CRIS.
Yeah, and then on the climate services piece, Dan, I think what we've been able to build through the SCS is really bringing new partners that have never been part of the climate conversation, like GSA, HUD, different components of DHS, including, you know, Customs and Border Patrol that use climate services. And so it's important to hear from them. And so, you know, maybe a next step is for you all to present to the SCS some of your work and kind of find those synergies, right, to maximize all our capabilities. You know, so I think that's the value of the SCS, is convening new partners, especially around user-oriented agencies.
Excellent. That sounds good. Any other questions, Megan?
I do not see any hands as of right now.
I have a
Bilal?
question. Thank you so much. That's very helpful. You know, I wonder if we could identify one of the variables, maybe building on what Terry said in the earlier discussions and what we are planning in the workshop. So I'm using temperature as an example. So let's say if we define temperature in terms of variables of interest for different documents, ASC documents, and then we will work to see what's the layer that we need to have in CRIS as a demo, just to understand it for one. I think the minute we prototype it for one, then we could open it up for many others to deal with other, you know, parameters. Would that something of this type would work?
I think that's a great idea. We would value that. We're in CRIS, we're planning to do several things. We'll do some pre-computes with the downscale climate projections featuring LOCA 2 and STAR, or the ensemble of them both. for selected geographies, so counties as well as 2 different watershed levels. And we're also going to be storing the full pixel resolution data, so that if people want to do more custom work, I can also imagine that your community would be very interested in things, specifically defined thresholds that you want to be able to look at, observed or projected exceedance of thresholds, and to be able to get information about that sort of thing to help guide informed planning or standards development or things of that nature. So to find people who are doing those types of developments and then sort of more systematically adopt and adapt those tools and resources, I think it would be interesting to have a conversation about optimizing a storefront or a tool set specific for your community. So, and obviously, if there are particular variables or data sets that are of use to you, we could focus on, as we build out the system, we could focus on those first.
I think across all variables, I could see there is a need for projection because we have different design lives and spatially, and the resolution could vary depending on the variable. And then exceedance probabilities. So I think these maybe 3 attributes really sums it up for a good number of the variables. Demonstrated for one, it will open up the doors, I think.
Right. Sounds like good opportunity for conversation. Julian, I guess the one comment I would make is, in your mall of storefronts, I'm kind of a Tractor Supply guy. So, Nordstrom's is great, but, we're very practical. So just kind of keep that in mind. Anyway,
Yeah,
thank you.
don't worry. Yes, practical. Yes.
Joe Barsugli
both
does
so
have his
much.
hand raised. Sorry,
Okay,
Dan.
excellent. I just don't want to drag Jennifer down too much here.
Yeah, Joe, don't know how long yours is.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, it seems like I'm more interested in this aspect at the end, which seems to be predicated on adopting the 2 downscale data sets that are being used at NCA 5. And I can see that as a tool that could be used in this, perhaps not the only one, because a lot of the hazards require information that's not in these downscale data sets. But there's also the issue that those are a very time-bound thing, particular methods, particular CMIP. And one thing we've been discussing a lot is how to make durable standards so you can write the language so that in 10 years, that standard, when science has moved on to CMIP 8, how this can actually work. I just wanted to bring that comment up that the whole downscaling issue, very many positives, very many difficulties with that in these applications. So I think that's a very, good area for discussion down the road.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you both again. Good comment, Joe.